Henry Calloway had always embraced the quiet isolation of his forest lodge. A retired teacher and widower, he found solace in the simplicity of his daily routine, waking before dawn, lighting the wood stove, and brewing strong black coffee. The crackling fire and faint aroma of pine resin were small comforts in the harsh winters of Pine Hollow. The lodge, built by his grandfather, sat on the edge of a vast wilderness, where towering pines stretched endlessly toward the horizon. For Henry, the lodge wasn't just home, it was a haven, a place where he felt at peace with himself and the world. His days revolved around tending the land and the small flock of animals he kept for company. But before we continue, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring the notifications bell so you never miss our upcoming stories. This morning, the cold seemed sharper, slicing through the air like a blade. Frost clung to the windows, forming intricate patterns that glistened in the pale dawn light. Henry sat at the kitchen table, nursing his coffee and gazing at the snow-covered landscape. The sky was a heavy grey, warning of the storm to come. The weatherman's voice echoed in his mind. A significant snowfall is expected across Pine Hollow tonight. Bundle up, folks. After breakfast, Henry layered into his thickest coat, gloves, and boots. The wind howled faintly outside, a reminder of what was brewing. He stepped into the cold, his breath rising in misty clouds. He fed the chickens, scattering grain across the snow-dusted yard, and checked the sheep's trough to ensure it wasn't frozen. The animals shifted restlessly, as if sensing the storm. Henry worked quickly, the chill biting through his gloves. Then he turned to the woodpile. Trudging through knee-deep snow to the back of the lodge, he muttered under his breath about the cold. When he reached the pile, he frowned. What had once been a towering stack of neatly split logs was now reduced to a few stragglers, barely enough to keep the fire going through the day. He couldn't recall burning through the wood so quickly, but there was no use dwelling on it. The storm wouldn't wait. He headed to the shed, grabbed his axe, and prepared to trek into the woods. The faint whine of wind threaded through the trees, a reminder of how little time he had before the snow came down. With the axe slung over his shoulder and the sled trailing behind, Henry set off, determined to gather enough firewood to ride out the storm. But his morning was about to take a turn he couldn't have imagined. The forest greeted him with its usual stillness, just the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting away. As he approached his favorite chopping spot, he found himself thinking of the stories his grandmother used to tell. Tales of the woods and the mysterious animals that protected them. He never put much stock in them, but on days like this, in the eerie quiet, he sometimes wondered. He raised the axe and brought it down on a fallen log. Just then, something caught his eye. Through a dense cluster of trees ahead, a strange, shimmering light flickered. Frowning, he straightened and wiped his brow. Curiosity got the better of him, and Henry set down his axe to trudge toward the light. He followed the glimmer through the trees until he stepped into a small clearing. There, half buried in a mound of snow and ice, stood something that made him freeze in place. At the center of the clearing was a block of ice, thick, clear as glass, and eerily upright, as if deliberately placed. Inside it was a shadowy figure, its shape obscured by frost clinging to the inner surface. Limbs, perhaps a head, could just be made out, but the details were distorted. The lack of clarity only heightened its unsettling presence. Whatever was trapped inside seemed larger and more menacing than anything he'd ever seen in the forest. Henry's heart pounded as he stepped closer, breath clouding in the cold air. The ice radiated an unnatural stillness, as though time had frozen around it. When he touched the surface, a jolt of cold unlike anything he'd felt before surged through his glove. A shiver crawled down his spine, not from the temperature, but from the strange energy emanating from within. The figure seemed almost alive in its suspended stillness. Frost and imperfections in the ice played tricks on his eyes, hinting at movement, a subtle shift, a twitch. He took a slow step back, unable to tear his gaze away. The air around him felt heavier, quieter, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Henry wasn't one to spook easily, but this was unlike anything he'd encountered in his 60 years. Logic told him to leave it and get back to chopping wood, but curiosity kept him rooted in place. Whatever it was, it didn't belong out here, abandoned to the elements. He fetched his sled from nearby and dragged it to the clearing. Laying a tarp over the wooden slat, he began the slow, grueling task of tipping the ice block onto its side. It was heavier than expected, forcing him to dig in his boots and brace against the cold. After several heaves, the block finally landed on the sled with a solid thud that reverberated through the ground. He gripped the sled's rope and began hauling it through the snow. The added weight carved deep tracks behind him, slowing his progress. Around him, the forest groaned and whispered in the wind, and a growing unease settled in his chest. Every few steps, he glanced back at the ice, half expecting the figure inside to move. The forest felt different now, heavier, as if the presence of the ice had shifted its balance. By the time the lodge came into view, his legs burned and sweat clung to his back despite the freezing air. He paused to catch his breath, leaning on the sled's handles and glancing down at the ice. At the lodge, he maneuvered the sled to the back porch and began unloading. With a crowbar, he eased the ice into position against a reinforced plank, crude but enough to keep it stable and sheltered. He stepped back and studied it again. The frost made details impossible to see, and the warped shadows inside stirred questions he couldn't answer. A wolf? Or something far stranger? Henry rubbed his gloved hands together. The storm was closing in, and he needed to prepare for nightfall, but he knew the image of that frozen figure would haunt his thoughts long after the wind began to howl. The ice block, with its strange, shadowy contents, sat heavy behind him, and the long haul had left his muscles aching. The figure inside hadn't moved, of course it hadn't, but each glance stirred his imagination. At the clearing, he steered the sled to the shaded side of the porch. With effort, he tipped the block onto the snow and covered it with a tarp. The cold would keep it preserved while he figured out what to do next. He stood for a moment, hands on his hips, staring at the frost-covered form. The details were still obscured, but its presence was impossible to ignore. Stomping the snow from his boots, Henry stepped inside, grateful for the warmth of the wood stove. He shrugged off his coat and reached for the phone. There was only one person he trusted with something like this, his cousin, Sophie Clark. An ecologist with years of experience in Arctic research, Sophie had studied everything from glacial formations to deep tundra wildlife. Though she now lived in Pine Hollow, her fieldwork had taken her as far as Ellesmere Island. If anyone could help him make sense of what he'd found, it was Sophie. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Surprised to hear from him during the day, he explained the discovery: a block of ice in the woods with a large, unidentifiable creature inside. Her curiosity quickly replaced disbelief, and she agreed to come over within the hour, cautioning him not to do anything reckless in the meantime. After hanging up, Henry couldn't resist telling a few close friends. He called Russ, the local mechanic, who dismissed it as likely just a bear that had frozen in a thaw. Henry wasn't convinced. It didn't feel like any animal he knew. He invited Russ to stop by if he wanted a look, then paced the kitchen, glancing often through the frosted window. The ice block sat just beyond the porch, hidden under the tarp, its mystery intact. He thought briefly about calling more people, but decided against it. Whatever this was, it needed to be handled carefully. For now, he trusted only Sophie to help him understand what he'd brought home. Headlights swept across the snowy driveway as Sophie's truck crunched to a stop. She stepped out, bundled in her winter parka, backpack slung over one shoulder, her breath visible in the cold air. Henry met her halfway and led her to the side of the lodge. Sophie knelt beside the ice block, pulling back the tarp. Her breath caught as she took in the sight. The frost obscured much of the figure inside, but its proportions were strange, and faint antler-like shapes hinted at something unusual. She ran a gloved hand over the ice, noting its clarity, like glacial ice. Whatever was inside was distorted by frost and refraction, but it was clearly no ordinary forest creature. Henry crouched beside her, still shaken by the discovery. Sophie retrieved a small scanner from her pack and swept it across the surface. It might have been an animal trapped in a flash freeze, possibly something prehistoric, but the shape didn't match anything she'd expect in these woods. Henry shivered, the cold mingling with unease. Sophie couldn't say if it was dangerous. The possibility of something still alive within was slim, but not impossible. The preservation suggested the creature might reveal more if thawed, though handling it would require caution and help. Inside, Henry brewed coffee, while Sophie reviewed her scans at the kitchen table. The wind howled outside, and firelight from the wood stove danced across the walls as they both tried to make sense of what they'd found. Sophie admitted the discovery was beyond her expertise. She knew specialists in glaciology and paleobiology who might be able to help and planned to send scans and photos to get their input. This, she said, could be a significant find. Henry felt the weight of that possibility. Attention might soon fall on Pine Hollow, but Sophie reassured him they'd take it step by step. For now, the ice was safe outdoors, the cold preserving it until they knew more. By the next morning, Sophie had already contacted two trusted colleagues, Dr. Clara Reynolds, a glaciologist in Ottawa, and Dr. Victor Yates, a paleobiologist from Vancouver. Both responded quickly. Clara confirmed the ice appeared to be thousands of years old, consistent with glacial formations, but Victor's reply stood out. The figure inside didn't resemble any modern species he recognized. With more data, he believed it could be a prehistoric remnant or something entirely new. Henry read the message in silence, the implications settling over him. Sophie's excitement was clear. This was bigger than either of them had anticipated. That night, the wind howled around the lodge, promising an even colder dawn. Henry didn't mind. The deep freeze was exactly what he needed. Sophie's final instruction echoed in his thoughts: keep it cold. Any cracks or uneven thawing could damage what lay hidden inside. Henry took every precaution, adding extra tarps and positioning the ice block away from the lodge to keep it insulated from the stove's warmth. Still, unease lingered. A sudden warm spell or curious animal could ruin everything. He set an alarm to wake every few hours, stepping outside with a flashlight to check on it. Each time, the shadowy figure inside remained still and unreadable. By mid-morning, Sophie returned with 2 colleagues. Clara confirmed the ice's ancient origin, likely preserved for thousands of years, while Victor focused on the figure's unusual proportions, noting it didn't match any modern species. Using portable equipment, they scanned the ice, measured its density, and took high-resolution photographs. Sophie translated their findings for Henry, helping him understand the risks involved. The primary concern was uneven melting, which could damage or destabilize the specimen. Until they could determine what lay inside, moving it remained a delicate task. Under Clara and Victor's guidance, the team worked late into the night, documenting and preserving every detail, aware they might be standing at the edge of a major discovery. By the end of the day, the team had gathered enough data for a preliminary identification. The next morning, Henry joined them as they reviewed scans on a portable monitor. The evidence pointed to a prehistoric ground sloth from the Pleistocene epoch, a massive creature that once roamed the region thousands of years ago. Sophie called it an incredible find, with the ice perfectly preserving the specimen. Relief washed over Henry. After all his worries about monsters, the idea of a giant sloth seemed almost charming. With the ice stabilized, arrangements were made to transport the block safely to a specialized lab. The discovery soon attracted media attention, turning Pine Hollow into a hub for reporters and scientists. For Henry, the experience was surreal. His quiet lodge became the center of a once-in-a-lifetime event, bringing pride to the small town. Months later, the preserved sloth was displayed as the centerpiece of a natural history museum exhibit, drawing visitors nationwide. The discovery not only brought recognition to Pine Hollow, but also revived interest in the area's natural history. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring the notifications bell so you never miss amazing tales like this one.